Okay, it is now 4:01, so I think we are going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all for joining us for this event today. Just as you know, this event is being recorded, but we will only record the presentation of the portion of the event. We will not be recording the question and answer portion. My name is Sarah Linkert. I am the Assistant Director of the Center for Russia, East Europe, and Central Asia here at UW-Madison. Today's sponsors include our center, CRECA, the Center for European Studies, and the Institute for Regional and International Studies National Resource Center. These are federally funded national resource centers that support K-12 educators and the general public in their understanding of regional and world affairs. We invite you to visit their websites and follow us on social media. We will be sharing links after this event. My colleagues Essie Lenchner and Eleanor Conrad will be running tech support. If you have any challenges, please use the chat function to contact us, and we will be again, as I mentioned, we will be sharing the links discussed during today's event and any digital resources in a post-event email. And we ask that you hold any questions until the Q&A. To begin, I would like to start with UW-Madison's land acknowledgement statement. The University of Wisconsin-Madison occupies ancestral Ho-Chunk land, a place their nation has called Dijon since time immemorial. In an 1832 treaty, the Ho-Chunk were forced to cede this territory. Decades of ethnic cleansing followed when both the federal and state government repeatedly, but unsuccessfully, sought to forcibly remove the Ho-Chunks from Wisconsin. This history of colonization informs our shared future of collaboration and innovation. Today, UW-Madison respects the inherent sovereignty of the Ho-Chunk Nation, along with the 11 other First Nations of Wisconsin. We have 4 featured speakers today, and I am going to introduce them in the order in which they will be giving their presentations, beginning with Professor Yoshiko Herrera. Dr. Herrera is a professor of political science at UW-Madison. She conducts research on Russian politics, nationalism, identity, and ethnic politics, political economy and state statistics or national accounts, and international norms. In Madison, Herrera teaches courses on comparative politics, social identities and diversity, and post-communist politics. And in 2021, she was for the recipient of the Chancellor's Distinguished Teaching Award at UW-Madison. She is also a former director of our Center for Russia, East Europe, and Central Asia, and the former co-director of the Institute for Regional and International Studies, and former director of the UW-Madison partnership with Nazarbayev University. Our second speaker is Niels Ringa, who is a professor of political science and director of the Jean Monnet EU Center for Comparative Populism. His research and teaching interests center on democratic political institutions and the European Union politics, populism, elections, legislative politics, political parties, policymaking, and political networks. Ringa's new book, The Language of Politics, Multilingual Policymaking in the European Union, investigates the impact of politicians' reliance on shared foreign languages and translation services on EU politics, and argues that it depoliticizes policymaking by reducing its political nature and potential for conflict. Catherine Jensen is our next speaker, and Catherine is an assistant professor of sociology and international studies at UW-Madison. She is the faculty coordinator of the Wisconsin Collective for Ethnographic Research and a faculty affiliate of the Latin American, Caribbean, and Iberian Studies program. She is a 2022-2023 Race, Ethnicity, and Indigeneity Fellow at the Institute for Research in the Humanities at UW-Madison. She researches race, politics, and refugees in the Americas with a focus on Brazil. And then finally, our fourth featured speaker is Jeremy Stoddard, who is professor and the faculty chair of the secondary education program. His research examines the role of media in teaching and learning history and democratic citizenship, with a particular focus on the engagement with difficult or marginalized histories and contemporary controversial issues. He has served as the editor for Theory and Research in Social Education and has held national leadership roles in the teaching history SIG of ERA, and as a member of the executive board of the college and university faculty assembly of the National Council for the Social Studies. I am really pleased to be able to welcome you all to this event today, and I'm going to turn everything over now to our first speaker, Professor Yoshiko Herrera.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to share my slides really quick. Okay. Okay. So thanks everybody for coming. I'm going to just briefly, hopefully, go over some key points, I think, in understanding the invasion of Ukraine by Russia and how things are going. I wanted to focus a little bit on the factors that led up to the war and some of the factors that are important for how things have gone. Okay, so the first is just the general question of why did Putin invade Ukraine? And I want to just mention 4 things. The first thing is that there is a sense of humiliation from the 1990s that Putin has emphasized again and again in his rhetoric. He felt that the Soviet Union breakup made Russia weaker. There was a lot of economic damage after the end of the Soviet Union. And NATO expansion, although it was not an objective security threat to Russia, it's kind of a symbol of this humiliation of Russia at that time, because it's something that Russia wanted to stop, but it did not have the power to stop it. But I want to note that humiliation in many ways is in the eye of the humiliated. So it's not that NATO actually posed an objective threat, but that it was interpreted by Putin and by many people in Russia as a symbol of Russian weakness. A second factor I think that's important is that Ukraine is particularly important for Putin because of a couple of different things. One is that the population in Ukraine had gone back and forth between being pro-Europe and pro-Russia, had different politicians from different factions in elections since the end of the Soviet Union. And so it was kind of on the border. But in recent years, it had made sort of decisive shifts towards a more European rather than Russian orientation. And it also had the experience of 2 successful social revolutions where Ukrainians went out on the streets and kicked out pro-Russian politicians. The picture on the upper right-hand corner is a picture of one of those from 2004. So Putin saw Ukraine as not that it's an objective military threat to Russia's security, but that Ukraine is a symbol of a country that is rejecting Russian influence and choosing a European path, and a country that has had successful social revolution, which is something that he fears in his own country. Another factor, which is actually one of the main areas of my research, is on identity. It's important to note that Vladimir Putin never accepted both the sovereignty of Ukraine and also the existence or importance of Ukrainian national identity, in particular, the growth of Ukrainian national identity after 2014. Instead, Putin pursued a kind of imperialist Russian project where he thought Russia should have sovereignty over lands of the former Russian Empire and lands of the former Soviet Union. Combined with that, as we just saw yesterday on May 9th, there's a big emphasis on the Soviet victory over Nazism, over fascism in World War II. This is one of the most important symbols under the Putin regime of Russian national identity. But something I think that is worth noting is that there is not, up until this war, there had not been sort of grassroots level hatred between Russians and Ukrainians. There's over 10 million Russians that have relatives in Ukraine. Ukrainians are the largest ethnic minority in Russia. There's a lot of intermixing family ties, et cetera. So this is just not a case of ancient hatred to the extent those cases even exist. But the fourth factor for Putin, I think we can think of in terms of just a massive miscalculation. Things that he thought would happen did not happen, or things that he didn't count on turned out to be important. The first thing is that the Russian side assumed that there would be no resistance from Ukrainians, that they would be greeted as liberators. That seems like kind of a joke, given the resistance there's been, but I think there's a lot of evidence that the Russian side really banked on the fact that there wouldn't be resistance, and hence they were unprepared to actually fight. In addition, Putin, I think, was buoyed by former military victories and atrocities that were committed in Syria, Chechnya, for example. So he just thought this would be similar to those experiences, and especially similar to the invasion of Crimea in 2014, where there was very little resistance. Putin also thought the sanctions generally would not be very strong, and he counted on the world to be divided and focused on other things and not particularly interested. I think he also thought that there wouldn't be very much media attention. And basically all of those things turn out to be wrong. Now, why would he make such wrong decisions? The picture on the right shows him with a meeting with his economic security team right after the invasion. You can see how isolated he is. There's rumors of his illness, of his fear of COVID, etc. But you can see that this is not a person that is really gathering information and making the best use of it. Just to note, I guess, to bring everybody up to speed, on the right is the map of Ukraine. I think it's also worth noting that Ukraine as a territory is the largest country in Europe. It's 35 times the size of Chechnya, which was a separatist republic in Russia. And whereas the Putin regime might have drawn some lessons from Chechnya, Ukraine is just a vastly bigger country. There's 44 million people. And so you can see that even with the pretty massive use of force that Russia has engaged thus far, they're still very much confined to the eastern parts of the country. Something I think also in terms of the Ukrainian side that really merits further discussion is to understand that even though there were really significant identity distinctions within Ukraine in the past, ethnic, linguistic, religious differences in the history of Ukraine were important. There has been a very big shift towards an inclusive Ukrainian national identity, and that has picked up especially since 2014. President Zelensky is a Russian-speaking Jewish president from the East. He got significant support from Ukrainian nationalists who wouldn't in previous times perhaps supported somebody like him for president. And I think that's all to say, especially since 2014, Ukraine has really been mobilized in terms of understanding the threat to their sovereignty and the need to be prepared for a further invasion, which unfortunately is what took place. This unity in elite and mass views of the nation, I think, are very critical factors in why the Ukrainian military has been so effective. But it's also a factor in terms of the lack of corruption in Ukraine since 2014, the dramatic reduction, let's say, in corruption. And also something that's proved to be very important during the war is the lack of collaborators with Russia. In 2014, there were significant defections. The head of the Ukrainian Navy switched sides, took a number of officers with him. There was a lot of regional elites and oligarchs in the East that were either unclear or to some extent siding with Russia. And a lot of that has changed since 2014 because people who were pro-Russia have already switched to the Russian side. And so who's left in Ukraine are people who are pretty committed to Ukrainian state and defending the Ukrainian state. And that is a very important factor in the lack of a political strategy on the part of the Russians in terms of even if they capture a city militarily, they don't actually have people that they can work with in order to govern. So what is next? Unfortunately, there's still probably a lot of violence in terms of Russia's plans for Ukraine. But in Ukraine, as I mentioned, there's currently a united, multi-ethnic, multilingual sense of unity that is strongly in favor of supporting and defending Ukraine as a state. There's much more international military support for Ukraine than there has in the past, and that's probably going to continue to grow. I think that there's pretty much no question that Ukraine is going to prevail and eventually join the EU, although maybe Professor Ringa has something to say about that. But in any case, it's going to come at great cost to Ukraine because Russia is prepared to use a lot more violence in the interim. I don't think Putin is going to stop voluntarily. He's going to stop when he faces a decisive military defeat, and that's what the Ukrainians are working towards. The sanctions, however, are really important, and they are going to continue to degrade Russian state capacity, but the energy sanctions are the really important piece, and that's something that's still being worked out. I think that Putin has done a good job in stopping the ability for opposition to organize or to protest in Russia, but that doesn't mean there isn't a lot of discontent in the country. And the economy in Russia, I think, for the foreseeable future is severely damaged. So there's a lot of negatives on the Russian side, but so far, unfortunately, they look somewhat committed to continuing the fight. Okay, and finally, what can we do? I think that it is a really depressing situation, but I do think on a positive note, there are some things that can be done, including it's actually a time in the US to talk about democracy, to talk about issues of power and institutions and supporting people's right to live in a democracy rather than Russia's approach, which is to just say might is right and to promote this idea that any powerful country can impose its will on the less powerful. And I think it's really worthwhile for students to talk with teachers in school and also among family and friends about what does it mean to have a democracy. This war gives people a chance to see what it means for people to stand up for values. There's a lot of also different options for local action, including showing support and protest and just coming out for Ukraine. Of course, there's always options for giving money for humanitarian aid, but I also think this is an interesting bipartisan moment in the US where there's a lot of support from both sides for supporting Ukraine. And so I think political engagement actually in this case is a very easy way to engage students in the political prospect productively. All right, and I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Guerrera. Okay, our next speaker is Professor Ringa.
Okay, hi everyone. Let me just pull up my slides. All right. Should be able to see this now. Okay, great. Hi everyone. It's great to be here. What I'm going to talk about today is the European response, and really I should say the EU response to Putin's war. And one of the things that I'll discuss is whether or not this is an impetus towards developing an actual common European defense policy, which is something that the EU has had ambitions to do for a really long time, but which has really not really gotten any traction. So, one thing that is quite clear is that the blame for the war falls squarely on Putin. But at the same time, the conflict also signifies a failure of EU foreign policy. And it really reflects a prior lack of strategic vision, of institutional capability, and also of the political will to pool military capabilities such that the EU, as the EU, not as its individual member states, but as an organization, might actually be able to discourage or deter an attack on a neighbor and ally. And so there has been a distinct disconnect in the run-up to this conflict between declarations of strategic autonomy and a geopolitical Europe on the one hand, and then the reality of EU impotence in an actual crisis situation like the one that we're experiencing now. And that impotence is grounded in most individual EU member states being unwilling or unable to maintain militaries that are capable of deterring an aggressor like Putin, and also a longstanding reluctance to instead develop a common EU defense policy and capability. So while the EU member states have been giving up, or the term that's sometimes used here is that they are pooling their sovereignty in many policy areas, their willingness to do so when it comes to national defense has been much more limited. And of course, that's understandable to a certain extent, right? National defense, national security, most directly and quite literally relates to the defense of vital national interest. And so sovereign countries are naturally reluctant to cede control over that. And then moreover, the EU and its member states have for decades been able to rely on an American security guarantee, no matter who was sitting in the White House. And that's no longer the case, and which is something that I'll come back to in a little bit. So Putin was, of course, very well aware of the disconnect between rhetoric and reality of a common European defense capability when he invaded Ukraine. And he also sought to take advantage of the combined impact of the EU going through really more than well over a decade now of continuous and overlapping crisis, including the Eurozone sovereign debt crisis, the migrant crisis of 2015-16, of Brexit, of COVID, and so on and so forth. So those crises have not only taken an economic toll, but they've also signaled a kind of erosion of solidarity amongst the EU member states, and they've contributed to a number of cleavages that have opened up between them. So Putin has, for years now, been trying to stoke the fire in this regard. So, divisions within the EU over democratic backsliding and attempts at undermining the rule of law have been actively fueled by Putin, both politically and financially, well before the war. So, basically through support for anti-democratic movements and parties across the EU member states. And so Putin's invasion of Ukraine is in that sense, in a way, that the culmination of an assault on the normative foundations of the EU, or at least of what the EU proclaims for itself: democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. And the conflict in Ukraine also goes counter to the EU's raison d'etre of preventing war on the European continent, which goes back to the very, very early days of the European integration process in the immediate post-World War II era. And then finally, the war, of course, also poses a direct existential threat to the European security order that has prevailed since the end of the Cold War, and to Europe's democracy. And so for all those reasons, it really constitutes a blow to the system. But Putin's action have also led to the continent having woken up to the necessity of hard power. And it may well be that the Ukraine war has altered the conditions for European cooperation in security matters. Europeans have realized, and some quite reluctantly, that their diplomacy, however well-intentioned it might have been, lacked the foundation of hard power, which appears to be necessary when dealing with Putin and maybe also others like Putin. So Putin basically saw the EU as talking and acting from a position of weakness, and it seems that he, figured that Europeans would not get in the way of his war, and that they'd have to compromise when negotiating an end to the conflict. And on that point, Putin has been proven wrong. Right? Leaders in the West have instead demonstrated, actually impressive degree of unity, and they have imposed crippling sanctions much more quickly than initially expected. So the EU's response has been surprisingly quick, and it has also been unprecedented. So there are several packages of sanctions that have been enacted, including restrictive measures on individuals with close links to Putin, severe economic sanctions, diplomatic measures, and also restrictions on economic cooperation and on Russian media outlets. And one thing that's important to emphasize here is that those sanctions are not easy or costless from the EU perspective, quite the opposite. The economic repercussions are and will continue to be felt across the EU and its member states. And that reality is probably going to intensify over the next few years as Europe is working towards decreasing its dependence on Russian energy. So in 2021, for example, 41% of the EU's gas imports came from Russia. The war has essentially put an end to the convenient pretense that economic and security considerations could be kept apart when dealing with Russia, and is now leading the EU and its member states to work towards diversifying the energy sources. And at least for the time being, European leaders are willing to bear the costs of exploding energy prices, and EU populations seem to accept their necessity. We'll see whether or not over time, debate over the repercussions of these sanctions will change that tune, but at least that is where we are. And at this stage, the EU's willingness to leverage its full economic weight as a coercive tool against Russia has essentially been on display. It's really important that the EU's response has gone beyond economic measures and actually includes material support for the Ukrainian war effort. The EU has agreed to support Ukraine with a set of assistance measures, including military aid worth more than $500 million to date. So for the first time, the EU is promising and providing lethal equipment ranging from ammunition to fighter jets to third countries. So in a way, this might actually mark the moment when the EU is in fact emerging as a genuine security actor on the international scene. At the same time, the EU is, of course, also kind of brandishing its reputation as a humanitarian actor, where it actually has much more experience in the past, and it provides humanitarian and financial aid to Ukraine, but also to EU countries that are sheltering Ukrainian refugees. And it is offering people who are fleeing from Ukraine temporary protection, which is an emergency mechanism that hasn't been used so far, I believe, that grants protection to a large number of refugees, including rights to residence, as well as access to labor market, medical assistance, and education. Aside from the EU, the member states have also stepped up. So individual countries have imposed their own sanctions on Russia. They've also are sending weapons, ammunition, medical supplies, financial assistance to Ukraine. And also notable is the kind of civic response to the humanitarian crisis. I think that I actually went a little here. There we go. This is where I want to be with my slides. Ukraine's neighbors have kept their borders open for refugees, and in ways that actually really stand in contrast to some of the responses that we saw to the migrant crisis from a few years ago. But most notable, perhaps, has been that at the end of February, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz announced what is, de facto a revolution in German foreign affairs, with previously unimaginable plans for militarization and increased defense expenditure. There's a special fund of 100 billion euros for defense spending over the next 4 years, and then a permanent commitment to stick to the 2% of GDP spending that countries that are part of NATO have actually committed to. Germany is also sending weapons to Ukraine. And all of these things have been utterly unthinkable just a few months ago. All right. So looking beyond this this particular current moment in time, the war has renewed debates on the future of a common EU defense policy and capability. And it's really too early to tell if the member states will, at some point hit the brakes again on these initiatives. But it also is clear, at least at this time, that key lines have actually been moved that previously were not to be crossed. So various EU countries are considering important institutional changes that they would have been very reluctant to pursue even just a couple of months ago. So Sweden and Finland, for example, are on their way to joining NATO. Denmark has announced a referendum in July to join the EU's common security and defense policy, from which it has thus far opted out. And so things are happening that maybe are suggestive of a genuine changes in attitudes towards a common defense, which in the past has been hindered not only by concerns for national sovereignty and internal divisions, but also, as I mentioned earlier, by Europe's ability to free ride on American security via NATO's Article 5. But it seems that the Ukraine war has at least temporarily forced Europeans to reconsider their collective strategic responsibilities and capabilities. And proponents of a joint EU defense community suggests that it would have, a variety of different positive outcomes. It would allow the member states to pool national capabilities, to overcome inefficient duplication, to address inadequate economies of scale in military procurement. All of which is again, we're talking about a union of 27 member states. And, just to give you an example, both the US and Russia use mainly one type of battle tank, while the EU member states operate more than a dozen. This, of course, creates problems of interoperability, of maintenance and supply, and of training. And so there's a lot that could actually come from joining or pooling resources and gaining in efficiency. A joint EU defense would also provide for European security in the event that Americans elect an unfriendly or isolationist president again, as they did in 2016. So after 2016, Europeans basically learned that one US election could effectively remove Europe's security guarantee, which has been upheld by every president, whether Democrat or Republican, since the end of the Second World War. And in 2022, they are now learning that Putin not only talks aggressively, but is actually willing to follow through. And so the combination of having a greater potential this combination, I should say, has a greater potential to provide an impetus for the development of a more independent EU military capability than any other previous context. But while the war in Ukraine may mark the beginning of a kind of EU as a serious military player, what that exactly means remains quite unclear. Member states have very different ideas about what that might look like, and it's not at all obvious how a joint European defense could exist next to NATO. And so the increase in defense spending by the EU member states, that all that are important first steps, but these efforts must be translated into some kind of institutionalized coordination at the EU level in order to actually gain a genuine foothold. And ultimately, the current political will and momentum would have to be sustained. And there are a number of factors that might inhibit further progress. Like institutional paralysis, the common foreign and security policy is actually one of the last remaining policy areas where decisions are made by unanimity. There is poor funding, poor coordination, and the relationship with NATO is also quite unclear and what that might look like. And then finally, what I mean here by democratic deficit is that the reality is that the ultimate decision to sacrifice the lives of soldiers in a war can only be made by a government that is seen as fully legitimate by its people, and whether or not the EU is actually a quasi-government that will be in a position to do so is a whole different question. All right, let me just take a moment here just to briefly talk about NATO. So prior to the invasion, Europe and the transatlantic alliance appeared weak and divided. Trump's presidency has undermined Europe's faith in the US, and all of that surely played a role in the Kremlin's calculations. But while NATO has long struggled to find a place in the world, following the fall of the Iron Curtain, Russia's aggression against Ukraine has now put NATO back in the spotlight and in a way rejuvenated the alliance. And so the war has actually accomplished two things that are partially in tension with each other. On the one hand, it has highlighted the importance of NATO and the transatlantic partnership for the EU, but at the same time, it also underscores the need for a joint European defense. And so, the war has essentially provided a renewed impetus for a common EU foreign security and defense policy, as well as for enhanced EU-NATO cooperation. And that's both an opportunity and a tension. How this will play out is unclear because we don't know whether or not the current political will inside the EU and the member states will actually be sustained. And we also don't know what's going to happen in the 2024 US election. So in any case, this is a kind of critical moment for Europe, the EU, and for its member states when they must consider the far-reaching implications of the decision to mobilize funding for lethal equipment for the first time. All of that also, of course, bears the very real danger of escalation, of direct confrontation with an enemy in possession of nuclear arms. And so the EU is and its member states are naturally cautious here, but still also are showing a determination that is unusual, to say the least. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Vinga. Next, please welcome Dr. Jensen.
Hello, everyone. It is such a joy and pleasure to be with you all. I'm just going to share my screen. So my name is Katie Jensen. As I was introduced, I'm an assistant professor of sociology and international studies at the University of Wisconsin. And Ukraine and Europe are not my area of expertise. And so my area of expertise is around asylum and refugee law and policy. And so that's really what I'll be speaking about today, is looking at Ukrainian forced displacement and sort of situating it in the global historical and legal landscape, both in terms of legal definitions, who is a refugee, as well as where are refugees, where are they from and where are they going. So then to start off, what are the current numbers? And this was as of 4 days ago of Ukrainian forced displacement. So the BBC News claims that there are more than 12 million who are believed to have fled Ukraine. And you'll even start to see here some of the legal differentiations where it's 5.7 million or more who have been forcibly displaced and fled Ukraine to neighboring countries, as well as 6.5 million who are still in Ukraine. So internally displaced refers to folks who have left their habitual home but have been forcibly displaced within their country of origin. So from the east to the west, for instance, rather than crossing an international barrier and entering another country. The most common country of reception being Poland, right? So the difference between moving within the country versus outside of it. And that matters for legal definitions, which is why, which I'll circle back to. But so situating then those numbers, so trying to remember the 5.7 million Ukrainian refugees, what is the demographic and legal landscape in which this is emerging, right? So situating Ukraine in the broader context. And these are numbers, I updated this today. This is from the mid-year 2021 report from the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, right? The UN Refugee Agency, which has the most comprehensive data around refugees and others who are forcibly displaced in the world. So all of this to say the data from here on out that I'll be showing is prior to the situation in Ukraine, the war in Ukraine, right? So these numbers do not include the numbers that I just highlighted of Ukraine, but it is the context in which this new instance of forced displacement is emerging. So not even including Ukraine, you could already say that as of 2021, 1 out of every 95 people on the planet is forcibly displaced. So to put that 84 million in context, if you brought all of those who are forcibly displaced in the world into a single country, it would be the 18th most populous, largest country in the world, right? So it would be a country with a population larger than the United Kingdom, larger than France, larger than Germany, larger than Iran, right? So to put those numbers, the size of the magnitude that we're talking about in a bit of scale, right? And again, this is without including the 5.7 million and likely to increase Ukrainians who have fled across borders. Now this graphic is a bit old. This one's from 2016. I've never been able to find a more updated version of this graphic, but I think it's helpful to start to then tease apart why I'm using the language of forcibly displaced and why we use the language of refugees. Because refugees, as I'll turn to later, is a legal definition, right? The idea of asylum is an international human right, whereas questions of being forcibly displaced speaks more broadly to forced migrants, which includes refugees, as you can see here, right? So there's as of 2016, there were 22.5 million refugees, but the broader population of those who experience forced displacement, including what we call IDPs, those who are internally displaced, which would be the other and indeed larger percentage of Ukrainians who have fled within Ukraine rather than across international borders. That's where you see the sort of broader, you have both those who are stateless, those who are internally displaced, those who are displaced across international borders, those who have received refugee status, those who are applying for refugee status. And that's where you see the sort of legal distinctions start to play out. I also like this infographic because it highlights the really infinitesimal, incredibly small number of refugees who will ever be resettled. So this is one particular year, but it's fair to say that about 1% of refugees are ever resettled in a given year. So 99% of refugees will not make it to a third country. And so what does that mean when I say resettlement? So we often talk in the United States in different moments about asylum, which is one legal process, and resettlement, which is a separate legal process. Asylum is usually what we talk about when we talk about folks coming from Mexico or Central America or within the Americas. Those are individuals who arrive in Brazil, or sorry, arrive in the United States, arrive in the United States and then claim the legal international protections of refugee status. On the other hand, those who are resettled have already received refugee status. Those are often individuals who are in refugee camps that then a third country, right? So not the country from which they fled, not the country of the camp where they are, but instead a third country like the United States or Canada chooses to resettle a certain number of refugees. And so the number of folks who end up being resettled is really incredibly small given the size of those who are experiencing forced displacement. And this matters also when thinking about the distribution of where refugees are in the world. About 76% of refugees actually do quite small migrations. And by that, I mean they are in neighboring countries, countries that neighbor where they have fled from. And we'll see that in some maps to come shortly. I also have here some resources. So again, this is, except for this slide, the data that I'm pulling from and the images come from the UNHCR mid-year report 2021, which I think is really helpful for having visual images and graphics for sharing and discussing these questions. And then they also have a refugee data finder, which is an interactive database, which can be really useful for assignments, for instance, or providing students the opportunity to go in and focus on a particular population, going, asylum seekers versus stateless, et cetera, across years, across countries of origin, destination, et cetera. It's a really powerful interactive tool that I'd also recommend taking a look at. So then before I go to the maps, now turning to the legal definition. So who is a refugee, right? I highlighted that the question of forced displacement broadly, and then the legal definition of who is a refugee. Now, we often, and I want to clarify, I think it's important to clarify this because we use refugee colloquially in ways that are dissimilar from its actual legal boundaries. And so by that, I mean, we often use the language of refugees for individuals who would not qualify under the international legal definition for refugee status, right? And sort of clarify, and that matters because refugee status comes with a set of rights and entitlements and protections that those who do not, who are not recognized as such won't have, right? So for instance, refugees have the right of refoulement, which means that they have the right to not be deported, right? Which in places like the United States and Europe, other contexts in which there are deportation regimes, which do not exist necessarily around the world, but in places where countries do detain and deport migrants, refugee status is then a crucial legal status that provides the ability to stay at its most basic. And then it has a range of rights and protections and resources that can come with it, pathways to citizenship, et cetera, depending on the individual national context where the person gets refugee status. But so then so this definition that you're seeing here, I think of the refugee legal definition of having sort of three key elements. And this is from 1951. This was the first time that a definition for who is a refugee was ever codified internationally. So following World War II and in the moment of early Cold War, the UN produced the UN Refugee Convention of 1951, which established who would qualify for refugee status. So one, that they're outside of their country. This is precisely the difference between internally displaced folks and refugees. right? You have to leave your country of origin or habitual residence in order to become a refugee, the importance of international borders there. And it also has a really very restrictive definition of what types of violences and forms of suffering allow someone to qualify for refugee status. So it's not folks fleeing general states of violence or conflict. It's not people fleeing environmental disasters and catastrophes. It's not necessarily people fleeing drug or gang violence, which has been a hot topic of legal debate in the US context, for instance, right? But the idea that as an individual, rather than fleeing a generalized context of violence, you as an individual are being persecuted on the basis of your membership in one of these 5 categories. So because of your political affiliation with a particular party, right, being a key leader in a political organization, for instance, you are being persecuted and targeted, or because of your religion specifically. Now, the last category, membership in a particular social group, is obviously, unsurprisingly, maybe if you look at it, is the place where there's been the most legal expansion since the 1950s. So over the last few decades, membership in a particular social group as a basis for getting refugee status has come to include both LGBTQ questions as well as gender-based persecution, right? So that the category of being in a also delineated way, but the idea that women, when they experience violence and persecution on the basis of being women, qualify for refugee status. That is something that didn't exist 40 years ago in law, but now exists in the United States as well as other countries. But again, there's all types of violences and forms of suffering that if they aren't individualized, or if they aren't on the basis of one of these particular identity categories, then the individual does not qualify for refugee status at the level of internationally the 1951 convention. Countries then, of course, have the United States versus Brazil versus Germany versus Kenya, have Uganda, have more expansive definitions in some instances where other forms of violence or persecution are included, right? Latin America, for instance, does include generalized states of a sort of failed state, but that is not at the level of the UN. I'll skip the sort of question of the protection of that country to sort of move on. I do want to highlight, before moving on to maps, that along with setting out that original definition, that 1951 definition, that is still the basis for asylum and refugee status throughout the world today, it was written into the 1951 convention that it only applied or could only apply to folks in Europe, right? So in 1951, only Europeans could be refugees. And I can talk more about how this played out, but basically only Europeans could be refugees in 1951. So the idea of refugee status as an international human right was actually understood that only Europeans had that human right. And this wasn't lifted until 1967, which with the shifting political context, which I'd be happy to speak about. But that is the legal landscape. And so when folks are talking about Ukrainian refugees today and a question around, for instance, that this is their largest refugee crisis in Europe since World War II, which was the impetus for the emergence of this definition of who is a refugee, what are they entitled to, that was also part of deciding who had access to these international human rights. And there's ways that this has afterlives and continued legacies today in terms of different restrictions that the Ukrainians are seeing versus Syrians versus other populations. So this is a range of definitions. This will be shared. I won't tease this out any more than I already have. But often with folks, and really with my students, I like us to sort of think and imagine where we think refugees are coming from and where we think they're going to, and how that can differ from the empirical realities. So this was from 2021. Again, it does not include the Ukraine. But it's worth sometimes thinking about, if I had time for a longer pause, where would be the populations of refugees that we might think of who is or is not on this list. And again, Syria is still, based on the numbers I showed at the beginning, Syrians are still the largest refugee population, now followed by Ukrainians, followed by Venezuela, which is a legally liminal. Some places they're recognized as refugees and other places they aren't. So again, this sort of shifting idea of who qualifies for what forms of protection. A bigger gap often here is also thinking about where we think refugees are hosted. So while we often focus on refugees in Europe, right, until this year, really focusing on refugees coming from the global south to Europe, the vast majority of refugees never have that experience. So the largest refugee hosts are always, as I mentioned before, the countries neighboring the countries from which people were displaced. So Turkey has been, continues to be a major host country, followed by Colombia because of Venezuelan forced displacement. Uganda is often a top one. Lebanon, last time I checked, 1 in 6 people in Lebanon is a refugee. So given the size of its population, it is one of the largest hosts per capita in the world. And so while we often think about Germany, the UK, Canada, the United States, those not actually where the vast majority of refugees are, which are 86% are instead in the global south, or what some folks would call developing countries. So thinking about why it is that we think about refugees in particular places and how that our perceptions may or may not dovetail with empirical realities of the demographic landscape. So I haven't been watching the clock, but I will stop here. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Jensen. And I think if we have time after, we can ask the audience, but I think we would all be interested to hear more of your presentation. And now I'm going to welcome our final presenter, which is Professor Jeremy Stoddard. Thank you, Jeremy. And after Jeremy's presentation, Jeremy will be moderating the Q&A.
Great. Thank you all. I'm going to apologize. I'm on a little bit of a low bandwidth, so I'm going to have my video off, but I am here, and Essie's nice enough to control my slides for me. So I was asked to talk a little bit about both translating this into what would this look like teaching about these topics in the classroom, and there's lots of great material from our 3 presenters so far, and then also thinking about how much of this conflict, at least for US folks and many folks in Europe, is being played out in social media and on various forms of news that you might be receiving. And so I'm going to really focus on that. My slideshow is really a data dump of sources, that a lot of which might be usable with sort of your middle and high school students. So if you want to follow along or check things out, everything that's on here is linked. And so you can use the QR code to be able to just go and access those right away if you want. I'm sure these will be followed up with you later too. You can go to the next slide, Essie. I'm sort of nicknaming this a fire hose of a presentation because I'm going to give you all sorts of sources, and the notion or metaphor of a fire hose is also sort of the current strategy of propaganda being used by Russia. So it's an apt one in that sense. So the first thing I want to talk about, and I'll pause here just for a second, and then you go to the next slide, is teaching about the concept of propaganda itself. And so I think we hear misinformation, disinformation a lot in the news. Disinformation is actually a historic term, as you're going to see. Really popularized by Stalin himself when he was in the early days of the KGB. But really we're looking at how do you come up with propaganda, and can we teach this as a concept formation lesson? The original forms of it actually come from a Catholic church, the Catholic Church, I should say, and a group basically formed to propagate or spread the faith. Today, though, obviously it's used a lot more in terms of referring to the use of mass communication to try to influence people on largely political views. And so I'm bringing from Renee Hobbs' book, Mind Over Media, which does a great job of sort of looking at modern forms of propaganda. You want to go forward, please? There are a lot of different definitions of propaganda. I think I'm bringing up a couple others here in part because Neil Postman's definition here also asks us to sort of look at how communication is used to invite us to respond emotionally, immediately, and in either either or manner, which I think is really appropriate right now, given the hyperpolarization in the US and other countries in terms of populism and nationalism, but also the ways in which these mass communications are designed to have us affectively or emotionally respond to them, and therefore sort of have this strong response linked to the polarizing ideologies that we're all sort of working in. And then I think this other one from Cunningham also brings up the notion of strategic communication. This is being done strategically, and in the Russian case in particular, outside of truth or truthfulness, and really trying to promote in many ways sort of chaos in the countries that they want to weaken. The next two slides, I'm just going to go through really quickly. And these are a whole bunch of background resources on the history of Russian propaganda, going up to sort of the present. And I think these are important if you don't have much of an understanding, because the Russians have a very long history, even pre-Soviet times, in terms of the use of propaganda very effectively and maybe very innovatively even. You want to go to the next one? So really, these are just a bunch of resources from various sort of English-speaking and popular, for the most part, press. So most of them are very usable if you wanted to excerpt them and use them for K-12 students. They're also from relatively reliable sources, so they should be, for the most part, accurate and useful with your students. All right, so I'm going to give you sort of a few different teaching strategies. If we want to go to the next slide, the first one is really looking at how can you build this into your history classroom. A lot of you right now might be in if you're teaching in the K-12 world, Cold War or post-Cold War, going into the present, your post-AP tests and trying to find things to do that's going to engage your seniors maybe. This is a really recent article. It just came out yesterday from Stefan Levesque and Arthur Chapman on how we can use historical reasoning to really engage in this sort of both historically, but also today in terms of the Ukraine invasion, how this plugs into Russia's sort of long-term historical narrative, and many of the things that Professor Yashiko was talking about at the beginning in terms of some of the mentalities and the ways in which Putin in particular reflects some of these long-standing Russian myths and uses of politics. Want to go to the next slide, please? I'm just going to give you a few examples of ways that I could just think of off the top of my head of how you could integrate this into your curriculum. The first is, the famous story of the Potemkin villages, which now is being questioned as to whether or not it was actually a piece of propaganda and sort of a myth and not actually occurring as it did, in terms of use of facades to make Crimea, which is timely, look sort of wealthy. The second is the Russian Revolution. There's a great collection from Ohio State that looks at propaganda examples from the Russian Revolution that can be used. The Communist International, or Comintern, which held several congresses and then became also sort of an arm of Russian propaganda. Stalin and the origins of the KGB, which is one of our sort of most widely used terms of disinformation, translated from Russian. If you're in the Cold War, and even going through into the present, there's lots of examples of how Soviet youth were indoctrinated. And this, I think, tells you something maybe if you're looking at sort of Putin's mindset in itself. And then one of the ones that I think is under-taught, but really could be explored, is how much there was Russian propaganda, especially reaching out to, say, African-American activists during the civil rights era, groups during different periods in the US from the 1920s on, that were trying to influence and, again, cause fractions within the US population. And that obviously you can tie to today, where we see Russian propaganda being sort of shared easily and widely, even among American sort of online journalism and press outfits. All right, so the first one is sort of how can we find ways of engaging historical inquiry? The second one is looking more specifically at helping students understand how disinformation spreads and happens. And I'm just giving you a game here actually called the Bad News Game, which you haven't played it. You can start tonight and you'll waste a whole bunch of time doing it because it's a very simple game, but very addictive. And it essentially puts you in the role of someone trying to manipulate using social media and trying to gain as many followers as you can from spreading news that we know spreads widely, but is often either fake or sensationalist. And so you're actually playing the role of this person. And in the classroom, how I use it is to have students play it, often in partners, talk through about why they're making the decisions they are, notice things like the emotional impact, how it sort of draws you in, just like social media is designed to do, if you're fans of things like the Social Dilemma film, and then have the students step back and reflect on what was it actually asking us to do? What's the system that's sort of being modeled? And then how can we be more thoughtful when we're, say, sharing a story on social media or evaluating some of the news that's coming to us? So games can be really useful. There's also, though, some other resources. If you want to go to the next slide, please. That really look in particular, since we're going into another election season here in 2022, and as our last couple of guests have talked about going into 2024, what's going to happen in the US. These are some good articles that really explore Russian strategies, especially going into the 2020 election, US presidential election, how disinformation was used and used quite effectively, and for a long time really under the wire, and really hard to root out, essentially, going into that 2020 election. And so again, this is something that you can use to look at how is propaganda being used, for example, by state TV and other sources within Russia. But also, if you just go in and start searching about the Ukraine conflict, trying to make sense of what is real, what isn't real, is that Ukrainian farmer really hauling a Russian tank behind their tractor, right? Where are these things coming from? It'll give you some ways to think about how that the social media in particular is being used to examine this conflict. All right, and then the third way to think about this is a strategy for helping you to sort of avoid disinformation and misinformation, and also become informed on the sort of day-to-day of the conflict. If you want to jump to the next slide, please. And this is something that I've been trying to work with teachers a lot more recently, is being more thoughtful about our information-seeking behaviors. And in this case, a strategy that essentially is, instead of going to news outlets, go and find the journalists that you trust. We know journalists today, generally speaking, they're carrying a video camera, they're doing interviews, they're photojournalists, and they're also sort of correspondents from the field. These are a number of sources that help you to think through who the actual journalists you want to follow, because they often also write for different outlets or go through an AP wire or similar. And so oftentimes it's actually better if you use something like Twitter or other types of social media to actually follow the journalist versus the news sources that are for profit. And not to say that journalists don't want to have people following them and being popular, because it helps them economically as well. But it does seem to be a way to get at finding sort of relevant, up-to-date information on what's going on. So NPR even gives you sort of a guide for developing a source list of people and different types of sources that you can use. I also highlight here the Pulitzer Center for Crisis Reporting, which is an organization in DC that funds journalists to go into areas where news outlets won't necessarily send them. And so generally they're viewed as a great source for understanding what's going on in these kinds of crisis zones. So the suggestion here is really to work with your students to evaluate journalists, try to identify a group of journalists or other organizations that they want to follow, and use that as a way to follow the conflict on a day-to-day basis. All right, we can go to the last one here. The last piece here has two parts. One is a lesson plan builder. It's a collaboration between PBS and the Pulitzer Center, which has a lot of great news documentaries and sources that helps you to sort of build it if you want to do a lesson, sort of today on what's going on in Ukraine, the roots of the conflict, and they keep it relatively up to date. The second part here gives you two different strategies that you can use if you want students to practice actually engaging with sources that they find. The first one's from the Stanford Online Civic Reasoning project, which is outlining this notion of lateral reading strategies, which really is just a way to help students to evaluate and sort of corroborate the evidence that they're finding in a particular story. So again, it's a habit of mind, a practice that they can use to evaluate information that they're finding online or in their news feeds. And the second one similarly is called SIFT, and I can't remember the acronym right now, but it's a series of 4 steps that again helps that you can teach students to use. And these are actually effective for undergraduate university students as well, to evaluate news that you're finding online or information that you're finding through various social media channels, to make sure that you're using things that are accurate or that you're thinking more ethically if you are sharing a story that's going to be viewed by others and you don't want to spread disinformation, for example. All right, that was a really quick run through. And like I said, all the links there are to the actual sources, so you can go on and go through them and find them yourself. I try to pick most of the sort of contemporary news sources in particular. Most of them have a readability that you could use it with at least high school students, if not middle school students, or excerpt it. So hopefully you can find them useful here in our waning last month of school, or not next fall when you get into the classroom. All right, I'm going to end there, and I think I'm even under time, which is pretty good. So we are on track for questions. And I think it would be great if folks have questions to go ahead and put them into the chat if you can, and or you can raise your hand and we'll try to identify you to bring up your question. I have a couple we can start with. I'll pause for a second, see if anybody has questions. The one question I was interested in that I think any of the three presenters could talk about would be really to look at, a lot of you talked about sort of surprises in the conflict that you were all noticing from your own sort of disciplinary standpoints. What I'm interested in what if you could speculate on what are some unanticipated consequences of the conflict on sort of long term on some of the issues that you raised. And I'm thinking of one is the impact on Ukraine's economy,